I knew something was off the moment I saw the table setting. Too many wine glasses, not enough name cards. We were at Palmetto's, the kind of restaurant you only expense when you're trying to impress someone who signs seven-figure checks. The client, David Hollenbeck, sat at the head of the table like a judge awaiting testimony. My seat? Not next to him, where I'd usually be. I was nudged down the row, 2 chairs away. Between me and the man whose systems I'd been duct taping together for 4 years was now Chad. Vice President Chad, if we're being generous. Just Chad, if we're being honest. He of the loafer with no socks species. The kind of guy who uses the phrase circle back like it's punctuation and thinks uploading a JPEG is tech work. Chad was a recent import, dropped into the org like spoiled cream into coffee. Nephew of our board chair, or maybe son of a golf buddy. I never asked, never cared. What I did care about was that ever since Chad showed up, my visibility on the project began evaporating faster than PTO after layoffs. And now, here we were, clinking overpriced Cabernets while Chad grinned like a possum in a trash can. This is a celebration, he declared, to no one in particular. The CEO nodded in that vague, distracted way rich men do when they've already mentally moved on to their next yacht. I smiled, tight-lipped, resisting the urge to ask what exactly we were celebrating. Was it the 200 hours of QA I'd just crammed into 2 weeks? Or the 7 production bugs I fixed while Chad was in Aspen doing investor-facing work? Look, before we go further, let me just say, if you're enjoying this train wreck already, hit the subscribe button and toss us a like. Seriously, 90% of y'all lurk like it's a full-time job, and it takes 2 seconds, keeps the stories coming, and it really does help the team. Okay, back to the burning wreckage. Chad had positioned himself squarely next to David, our client, leaning in like they were fraternity brothers reminiscing about spring break. I caught snippets, Chad talking about scaling strategies and value-aligned outputs, which was impressive, considering he still didn't know what the acronyms in our dashboards stood for. David wasn't biting. He gave Chad polite nods, but his eyes kept drifting. Once, they landed on me, and lingered. Karen, he said during the appetizers, almost casually, you're still running point on the deployment logic, right? My fork paused halfway to my mouth. Of course, I said. Why? He just smiled. Just curious. Chad cut in fast. We're transitioning responsibilities, actually. Big picture stuff. Karen's been amazing, obviously, but we're, restructuring talent toward high-level delivery frameworks. Translation. Chad was trying to box me out and take credit for the product I built from scratch. Again. The CEO said nothing. Not surprising. He'd stopped noticing me once Chad started calling him boss man in meetings. I nodded and turned back to my plate. I'd seen this movie before. The silent replacement. The slow erasure. The don't make a scene whisper campaign, where women like me are expected to disappear quietly while a guy who's never logged into the admin portal gets the handshake and the bonus. But I wasn't going to disappear. Last week, I noticed my permissions had been downgraded. Just a little. Nothing flashy. Just access to our back-end monitoring dashboard. Gone. My name disappeared from the Git push history. I'd bet my left eye that was Chad's idea, probably pitched to IT as cleaning up redundancy. Cute. I didn't raise a stink. I made a note. Tonight was the trap. I could feel it in my bones. HR was mysteriously absent. Normally, for a celebratory dinner with our biggest client, they'd be hovering like flies on a buffet line. But not tonight. Just me, Chad, the CEO, and a client who kept glancing at me like we shared a secret. And maybe we did, because Chad didn't know I'd had coffee with David's CTO 2 weeks ago. He didn't know I'd built a parallel deployment path under a private contract clause they'd never read. And he sure as hell didn't know what was coming when dessert hit the table. The calamari hadn't even cooled before David leaned over his wine glass and said, Hey Karen, quick question. Those logic layers in Phase 3? That was you, right? I blinked. He said it like someone confirming a hunch he'd already verified 6 different ways. My fork hovered midair. Depends which layers you mean, I said lightly. The recursive auth loop or the load balancing failsafes? David chuckled. Exactly. He knew, not guessed, not assumed. Knew. That question wasn't curiosity. It was confirmation wrapped in pleasantry. And just like that, my stomach stopped caring about the $28 calamari. Your framework caught the attention of our internal audit team, he continued. Said it looked, how'd they put it, too clean to be outsourced. I forced a polite smile. I like my code like I like my whiskey. Neat. No surprises. He gave a satisfied nod. That was it. No fanfare, no praise, just that quiet acknowledgement. It settled between us like an unspoken pact. And then Chad bulldozed in with all the grace of a toddler in a drum circle. "Oh, you're talking about the handoff phase?" he asked, his voice a full octave too loud. "Yeah, we've been working on streamlining that. I've got some new architecture paradigms I've been meaning to show you. Really gets the noise ratio down." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. The only thing Chad had been streamlining was the amount of actual work he did. His architecture paradigms came from TikToks with electronic music in the background. David didn't even turn to acknowledge him. He just sipped his wine and leaned back in his chair like he was watching a rerun he already knew the ending to. That's when I noticed something odd. David's assistant, Jules, always professionally invisible, had sidled up to the server with a whisper. She pointed to the menu, circled something with her finger. The server nodded and ducked into the kitchen. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I saw the signal, the to-go gesture. They weren't planning to stay for dessert. My mind started spinning faster than a fan on a server rack in July. Why ask for a to-go dessert at the beginning of the meal? Why ask me about code ownership in front of Chad? Why now? Because he wasn't just confirming what he already knew, he was making sure I knew that he knew. I glanced at my phone under the table. One new text. Green. That's all it said. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Chad was still monologuing about iterative velocity and some nonsense about cloud elasticity when David's eyes slid back to me. "And Karen, how's your team holding up with the push timeline? Still grinding away at those test environments?" I gave him the smallest of nods. "Just wrapped up the last integration test this morning. Clean runs across the board. We're locked and loaded." Chad chimed in again, desperate to reclaim the moment. "Yeah, we've been tightening things up, making sure everything's centralized. No more of that old-school hero-developer culture, you know?" I didn't look at him, but I could feel him swelling with pride at his own buzzwords, completely unaware that the hero-developer he was trying to sideline was the only reason anything still worked. David swirled his wine and said, "That's good, because in my world, clarity matters, and so does knowing who to trust." There it was again, that edge to his tone, like a man laying a card face down and daring you to flip it. I held his gaze, my pulse steady. He knew about the alternate pipeline, or at least suspected, and I was starting to believe he wasn't just okay with it, he was counting on it. From the corner of my eye, I caught Jules stepping out the front door and placing a call. No idea who she was dialing, but it didn't feel random. This wasn't just a dinner. This was a chessboard, and someone just moved a knight into check. The appetizers were cleared. Chad leaned back in his chair like he'd won a round, oblivious to the current running under the tablecloth. I just kept smiling, chewing slow, and waited for the trap to spring. The steak was still bleeding when Chad raised his glass like he was toasting the fall of Rome. "Before we dig in," he said, grinning like he'd rehearsed it in the mirror of his overpriced condo, "I just want to take a moment to thank Karen for her incredible work on this project." I paused, knife mid-slice. The table quieted. My instincts curled in on themselves. Chad continued, "Seriously, this rollout has been a massive lift, and Karen's done a phenomenal job tying a bow on it." "Tie a bow?" "And as we look toward scaling up and diversifying our resource pool," he went on, "we'll be rotating Karen off this account post-deployment. This is her final project with the client." There it was, delivered with the same tone someone might use to announce a vegan cake option. The CEO barely looked up from his plate, just nodded, like this was already baked into his calendar weeks ago. I glanced at David. He didn't move, just pressed his napkin to his lips and stared at his plate like it had personally offended him. "Of course, we're excited about the new faces stepping in," Chad chirped, "and Karen's been so gracious during this transition. A real team player." I swallowed my fury. It tasted like copper and old batteries. My promotion had been stalled for 16 months. My name had been removed from our engineering blog post last quarter, after I wrote the damn thing. And now this. A demotion gift wrapped in corporate speak and served alongside a filet mignon I suddenly had no appetite for. I smiled, tight enough to crack enamel. Understood. Just that. No pushback. No performance. I cut into my steak, still pink and warm, and let the silence ring louder than any protest. Chad nodded like he'd just landed a joke, and everyone laughed. See? Always professional. I didn't look at him. I didn't have to. David finally spoke, his voice flat. So, who's taking over exactly? Chad jumped at the chance to list names. A mishmash of mid-tier managers with about as much familiarity with the client as my houseplants. David didn't respond. He just sipped his water and reached for the salt like the conversation bored him. I checked my watch. 8:12 p.m. I flagged down the waiter as he passed. Would you mind bringing out dessert now? I think I'll need to head out a bit early tonight. Chad perked up. Something going on? I shrugged. Just have some things to wrap up before tomorrow. That wasn't a lie. What I had to wrap up was 2 laptops, an encrypted flash drive, and the last security patch for the external deployment pipeline I'd been refining since the first time Chad referred to me as his tech gal in front of the CFO. The rest of dinner played out like a slow funeral where the deceased was still sitting upright. David barely spoke. The CEO made small talk about golf. Chad rambled on about momentum pivots and agile transitions while buttering a roll like it owed him money. Every so often, Jules, David's assistant, glanced at me like she knew the count on the detonator. When the server returned with dessert menus, I was the only one who ordered. Apple tart, no ice cream, sweet, sharp, easy to walk out with. Chad leaned back and raised his glass again. To new chapters. I didn't raise mine, just smiled. To clean endings. He laughed, not realizing I wasn't joking. David finally spoke again as the plates were cleared. Karen, can I ask, do you have the final build on hand tonight? I paused for half a beat. Yes, I said. It's on my machine. He nodded once, and that was it. Nothing more. The table went quiet again. Chad stared, sensing he was no longer the loudest signal in the room. I folded my napkin, placed it gently on the table, and waited for the apple tart to arrive. This dinner had started as a trap. Now it was just the warm-up act. I excused myself just before the tart hit the table. Apologies, I said, pressing 2 fingers to my phone like I had a call. Chad waved me off with the same dismissive flick you'd use for a gnat, the kind that bites, but you don't notice until it's too late. I walked down the hallway, past the wine wall and the snooty host stand, until I found a quiet alcove near the restrooms. No mirrors, no cameras, just soft jazz and low light. I tapped my screen, opened the encrypted app, and typed 2 words. Go for it. Then I powered the phone off. Not airplane mode, not silent. Off. Because the moment that message went through, my part was done. Back at the table, I imagined Chad filling the silence with more of his inspirational gibberish. Probably waxing poetic about building bridges, or team succession. The kind of phrases you use when you're trying to disguise a hatchet job as a promotion. When I returned, dessert had arrived. My tart glistened under a sugar crust, untouched. David's plate was empty. Jules was gone again. Chad looked up with mock surprise. You missed my toast. Tragic, I said, sliding into my chair. Don't worry, he continued, flashing that smirk he'd probably trademarked. I said something nice. Genuinely. I said you're not big on sentimentality, but you've always been dependable. You know, rock steady. Rock steady. Like a desk chair you don't bother oiling. Like a piece of infrastructure you assume will never break. Until one day, it does, and your entire server room goes dark. David sipped his wine, his expression unreadable. His eyes stayed on me, but he didn't speak. The CEO, now 2 bourbons deep, leaned back in his chair and scrolled through emails on his phone like he was waiting for dessert to end his suffering. No one asked what the call was about. No one asked why I was calm. They should have. Because inside that go for it text was a script, a deployment trigger. And behind that trigger was a mirror system, external to our VPN, off the corporate books, with a full audit log and time-stamped updates. I hadn't just built a parallel deployment structure. I'd built a kill switch. My hands were steady as I took my first bite. Tart, still warm, cinnamon with a vinegar kick. Chad tried to make more conversation. We've got a lunch set next week with the regional managers. Gonna walk them through the new org chart. I think it's time we start looking at where your skill set fits best going forward. I chewed slowly. You'll let me know how that goes. He laughed like I'd told a joke, even though I hadn't. David finally set his wine glass down. Karen, can I ask, who approved your sandbox architecture? The one with the modular rollback? I met his eyes. No one did. That wasn't in scope. But the rollback is clean. Versioned to the minute. Fully audited. Chad's forehead wrinkled. Wait, what sandbox? I turned to him, blinking innocently. The one you said was too old school for your vertical model. You remember. I demoed it in the Q3 sync, but you were busy. Vegas, I think? David's jaw flexed. Just once. Chad chuckled, nervously. Right, that thing. Legacy overlay stuff. Nobody said anything. The air at the table had thickened into something slow and humid, like a Florida summer or the inside of a data center right before a fuse pops. Jules returned, whispered something into David's ear. He nodded once. I checked the time. 8:39 p.m. The CEO pushed back from the table and said something about needing to take a call. He wandered off toward the bar. I didn't bother watching him leave. Chad poked at his dessert like it had betrayed him. We should probably start looping in ops next week. Make sure your handoff goes smooth. Maybe do a shadow period, ease the transition. I sipped my water. If there's a transition. That made him pause. What do you mean? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because right then his phone buzzed. Once. Twice. Then it went quiet. David didn't look at him. Didn't look at me. He just reached for his briefcase, pulled out a small folder, and set it beside his plate. Chad eyed it but didn't dare touch it. No one moved. No one spoke. And in that silent pause, somewhere outside the building, a server flipped to green. A new log entry was written. And the deployment clock, my deployment clock, started counting down. The apple tart was half gone when David set his fork down, folded his napkin with surgical precision, and turned toward me like he'd been waiting for the room to finally shut up. Karen, he said, his voice so even it cut through the clink of silverware and soft jazz like a scalpel. The final build. Is it on your machine? The air shifted, just slightly, the way it does before a thunderclap. I wiped my mouth with my napkin. It is, I replied, calm as a sleeping dog with one eye open. Fully validated. Last update pushed at 5:17 this afternoon. Chad gave a half laugh, half snort. Yeah, we've got that mirrored internally, of course. Engineering's prepping the release candidate for next week. Legal still has a few. David raised a hand, palm flat. Excellent, he said, his eyes never leaving mine. Let's go deploy it, at my office. He pushed back from the table. It was a clean movement, no theatrics, just a quiet declaration that something sacred had ended, and something far more dangerous had begun. Chad's fork slipped off his plate and clattered onto the tablecloth. Wait, what? He sputtered. You want to, right now? As in, tonight? David stood, smoothing his blazer. Is there a reason not to? Well, legal hasn't signed off on the post-handoff protocol, Chad stammered. And, technically the deployment environment's still under our firm's jurisdiction until the... David didn't even blink. We're deploying tonight, with Karen. The CEO, who had just returned from his alleged phone call, froze halfway into his chair. Hold on, that's not... I already have final acceptance authority per clause 4.2 of the SOW, David replied, still not raising his voice. If the build is clean, and Karen assures me it is, then I'm greenlighting it. He turned to me. Shall we? I stood. There was no rush in my movements, no gloating smile, no dramatic speech. Just a deliberate calm as I slid my laptop into its sleeve, snapped the zipper, and adjusted the strap across my shoulder. I took one last sip of water. Chad stood too, stumbling into his words. Wait, I don't think this is, our team should probably be present. At least one senior architect should. David looked at him the way you might look at a man offering to valet your car after you've already parked it yourself. You're not needed, he said flatly. Jules appeared behind him, holding his coat and an envelope. She handed it to him. He didn't open it, just tucked it under his arm. Chad reached toward me, voice cracking with a brittle smile. Karen, if this is some kind of miscommunication, we can work it out. Let's just all sit back down, maybe talk through the next steps. I tilted my head slightly. Chad, you said it yourself. This is my last project. His face drained. Well, I didn't mean it like... I know what you meant. I said, and turned toward the door. David gave a small nod to Jules, who lingered near Chad as we walked past. Not blocking him exactly, but not inviting him to follow either. The restaurant fell quiet. No one called out. No one stood up to stop us. Behind me, I could feel Chad vibrating in his loafers, unsure whether to beg or bluster. The CEO was pale. His bourbon sat untouched. David held the door open for me like I was the client. Outside, the air was cool and sharp. A car was already waiting at the curb. He gestured to the passenger door. "After you." I got in. He followed, silent, letting the door shut behind him with a satisfying click. As the car pulled away, I glanced back through the window just in time to see Chad rush out the restaurant doors, phone in hand, mouth open. But the glass sealed his voice into a silent panic. All I saw was a man who'd finally realized the elevator he thought he was riding to the top had no floor beneath him. And I? I just reached into my bag, pulled out the USB key, and let my thumb rest on its brushed metal surface like it was the hilt of a knife I no longer had to draw. We barely made it 10 steps toward the car before I heard the frantic slap of dress shoes hitting asphalt behind us. "Wait, wait!" Chad's voice cracked like an off-key violin. "We should talk. This is a misunderstanding." David didn't stop walking. Neither did I. The night was clean and crisp, the kind of cold that bites just enough to keep you alert. My laptop bag bounced lightly against my hip as we moved, the weight inside it feeling less like equipment and more like leverage. "David," Chad huffed, catching up, breathless despite the short distance. "We haven't reviewed the IP handoff schedule yet. Legal hasn't signed the build certificate. You can't just take her and deploy." David didn't turn. "That's exactly what I'm doing." Chad reached out, grasping at straws, and at my elbow. "Karen, you can't walk out with proprietary software. That build belongs to the firm. That's our IP." I stopped, not to flinch, not to argue, just to end it. Slowly, I turned to face him. "Check the contract," I said, voice flat as steel. "Final deployment rights reside with the named engineer. That's me." His mouth opened, closed, opened again. But that clause, that was meant for emergencies. It's just boilerplate. Nobody ever invokes it?" I stepped forward, just enough to close the space between us. "Funny thing about boilerplate, Chad. It only feels meaningless until someone knows how to use it." He blinked, eyes darting to David like a child hoping the teacher will save him from the principal. David adjusted his cufflinks. Clause 6.7. Deployment, execution, and acceptance are at the discretion of the named engineer if access or continuity are at risk. That clause was reviewed by your firm's legal team. Twice. Chad's face turned the color of overcooked shrimp. "This is insane. She doesn't have clearance to walk out with client data. I'll call security. You'll do nothing," said a voice behind him. Jules. She'd materialized from the shadows near the valet stand, holding a tablet and a manila folder. She stepped forward and calmly inserted herself between Chad and the rest of us. "You're not invited," she said, without raising her voice. "If you attempt to interfere with the client-side deployment, we'll treat it as a breach of contract. And obstruction." Chad stammered. Who even are you?" Jules gave him a look so withering it should have come with a wind chill. "I'm the one who already logged tonight's transition authorization into the audit trail, with Karen's key, verified twice." His jaw unhinged. No, you can't do this. She works for us." David finally turned to him. "Not anymore." That sentence hit him like a bat to the sternum. He stumbled back, just slightly, as if the world tilted under his feet. "But the codebase, the platform, everything runs through." I stepped in. "Through a deployment wrapper I built off-site, with client-side redundancy. You had every chance to learn how it worked. You never showed up." "You blindsided me," he hissed, dropping all pretense. "You went around me." I stared at him, the years of late nights, invisible work, and buried contributions rising behind my eyes like ghosts. "No, Chad, I went through you." He lunged one last time, voice shrill. "That's company property in your bag." David's hand went up. "Enough." He pulled a slim folder from his coat and held it out. "This," he said, "is a formal authorization of release, signed by legal, with Karen named as sole executor of the final deployment process. It's notarized, timestamped, and countersigned by your firm's compliance officer, who, by the way, left me a voicemail yesterday that you'd probably try something like this. Chad didn't take the folder. Couldn't even look at it. His hands just hung there, limp, like they'd forgotten what they were for. Jules opened the car door. I stepped in without another word. As the door shut, I saw Chad take a slow step back. Shoulders sagging, eyes hollow. Not angry. Empty. Like a man who just realized he's locked himself in a house with no exits, and every light going out one by one. The engine hummed to life. We pulled away. Behind us, in the parking lot, Chad stood under the glow of a flickering light, a ghost fading into fluorescent buzz. I didn't look back again. 3 weeks earlier, I sat across from David in a quiet corner booth of a no-name Italian place far off the company radar. No wine, no small talk, no corporate handlers, just him, a black coffee, and the kind of silence you don't interrupt unless you're sure. "I assume you're not here to vent," he said, stirring nothing into the coffee. I shook my head. "No, I'm here to ask how much you value clean code, clean handoffs, and never having to speak to Chad again." That got a smile. Barely. The corner of his mouth twitched like an old machine starting up. I slid a folder across the table. Inside, a schematic, a printed deployment flowchart, and a digital key stub etched onto a metal card. A shadow copy of the primary system. Mirrored, monitored, external. Redundant deployment path, I explained. Encrypted, hosted on a locked environment under your preferred specs. All traffic isolated from our firm's internal network. Logs roll every 30 seconds. No patching window needed. You sign, it goes live. David flipped through the pages without asking questions. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to be sold, just shown. "And why?" he asked after a moment. "Is this not the plan your firm submitted last quarter?" I met his eyes. Because Chad tossed it, called it overly complex, and said I was gold-plating the process to justify billable hours. "Were you?" "No, I was protecting your uptime." David nodded once. "What do you need from me?" "Agreement," I said. "Your signature on this fallback, held privately. And if things go south, your go-ahead to push live through my key." He leaned back. "Contingency?" "Call it inevitability insurance." He exhaled slowly, staring at the paper. "You're betting your career on this." I already lost that bet the moment Chad learned how to pronounce machine learning. He tapped the folder once. "One condition." I waited. "No spectacle," he said. "No dramatics, no power plays. If we go this route, we go quiet. Clean. No glass shattering. You understand?" I nodded. "That's how I work." He extended his hand. We shook. The next morning, I submitted a fake version of the final build to Chad's streamlined workflow, a dead-end container with no live credentials, and a dummy schema labeled as a late-stage refactor. He didn't even notice the access logs were empty. That night, I revoked every internal deployment credential linked to my name, pushed a new SSH key, moved the encrypted mirror to the client's private cloud node. I slept like a stone. From that point on, every internal push was a puppet show. The real code, the heartbeat of the entire platform, lived in a vault with two-factor authentication and a log history that would make a forensic auditor weep tears of joy. Only 2 people could touch it, me and David, and only one of us had fingers on the button. Every time Chad tried to drag my name out of an email thread or loop in someone with less experience and more confidence, I let him. Every meeting I was excluded from was a blessing. Every decision he made without consulting me was another shovelful of dirt on his own credibility. Because while he was hosting alignment calls and rearranging slide decks, I was building a parallel universe. One where things worked, one where he didn't exist. I even preloaded the deployment confirmation screen. So when the moment came, all I had to do was plug in the key, authenticate the final hash, and let the system do what it was always built to do. Work perfectly without him. I didn't tell anyone at the firm, not even my old mentor in QA. If this failed, I'd be out with nothing but a vague reference and a pile of NDAs. But if it worked, they wouldn't be able to stop it, or spin it. They wouldn't even see it coming. And now, in the black car gliding through downtown lights, I looked out the window and thought of all the nights I'd stayed late patching bugs Chad didn't even know existed. All the weekends I'd rebuilt modules after his streamlining broke dependencies he couldn't spell. The back channel wasn't a betrayal. It was a lifeboat. And now the ship was sinking behind me, taking every fake title and empty meeting room with it. Chad burst through the glass doors of HQ like a man who'd just realized the GPS was lying, and the road he'd taken ended in a ravine. The security guard barely had time to wave before Chad was sprinting past the reception desk, phone already jammed against his ear, barking into legal's voicemail like it owed him money. "Hey, it's Chad. Call me back immediately. We've got a situation with deployment access. Karen just left with the client, she's got the build, and I don't think she has authorization to push it. I know, she's going rogue." Upstairs, the lights in the war room were still on. Monitors hummed quietly, dashboards aglow with placeholder data. Everything looked ready, prepped, curated for a launch party no one would be attending. Chad shoved into the room, nearly toppling a swivel chair, and jabbed at the nearest keyboard. He tried the deployment shell. Command rejected. Tried again. Rejected. He called IT. "Run a credential reset on the deployment server. I can't access the push." A pause. Then IT, cautious. Chad, the SSH gateway's been rekeyed." "What?" "Last night. Timestamped at 2:14 a.m. It's no longer mapped to our internal IP range." "What does that mean?" "It means it's not accepting commands from inside our VPN anymore. The access point's external." Chad's mouth moved, but the words didn't come. Just air. The war room felt different now. Off. Like walking into a chapel that's been deconsecrated. The big screens were just lights and pixels. No magic. No power. Just shadows of a system that had already moved on. He yanked his phone back up and called the CTO. "Did you know about this?" Chad barked before the man even finished saying hello. "Karen rerouted the deployment environment. She cut us out. I can't even access the runner queue. You're the tech lead. How did this happen?" The CTO sighed. "Because she built it that way, and you let her." "What does that even mean?" "It means you were so busy cutting her out of meetings you didn't realize she was the only one holding the master key." Chad dropped into a chair. The room swirled. In the hallway, someone mentioned Karen's name. Laughter followed. The kind of laughter that carries a little awe, and a little fear. He stormed down the corridor to legal, fists clenched, jaw twitching. The general counsel, Marcia, unbothered as ever, was already flipping through a hard copy of the SOW like she'd been waiting for him. "Why wasn't I told about Clause 6.7? Chad barked. "The one about developer control? I thought we owned the code." Marcia didn't even look up. "You own the code. You don't control the deployment. There's a difference." She slid the document toward him with a red fingernail tapped to the highlighted line. "Final deployment authority shall remain with the named engineer until client-side acceptance is formally executed in writing." Chad stared at it like it had grown teeth. "Who let that through?" he asked, voice dropping. Marcia gave him a look. "You did." His hands gripped the edge of the table. "We need to, what, threaten her? Demand the client delays the launch? There's got to be a leverage point." Marcia raised one brow. "Do you want to breach contract with our biggest client 2 hours before they go live? You'll tank the whole partnership." "But this isn't fair." "Neither is gravity," she said, and turned back to her screen. In a conference room 3 floors up, the CEO finally wandered into the meeting they were supposed to start 40 minutes ago. He looked around at the empty chairs, the blank screens, the untouched coffee. "Where is everyone?" he asked. Chad arrived seconds later, wild-eyed. "She's gone," he said. "With the code, with David. They're deploying it tonight." The CEO blinked. "I thought we were handling that next week." "We were, but she had a back channel." "A back channel? What the hell does that mean?" "It means," Chad muttered, "we're locked out of our own go-live." The CEO frowned. "Didn't we own this code?" Marcia, who had followed them in with the contract, opened her mouth and read aloud like a eulogy. "Deployment rights reside with the named developer until final client acceptance." The CEO went quiet. The projector clicked on by itself, part of some leftover automation from an earlier demo, casting a presentation slide across the wall. Q4 launch readiness. Below it, a photo of Karen, taken last year, the only slide Chad forgot to scrub. The CEO stared at it. No one said a word. And somewhere across town, the real system, the one that worked, the one that mattered, was already humming to life. With no audience, no drama, and no more room at the table for anyone who didn't know how to read a contract. The elevator doors opened to a silent, carpeted hallway lined with abstract art that probably cost more than my annual bonus, when I used to get one. David walked beside me, not speaking, not rushing, just calm. Like a man who'd already watched this movie, knew the ending, and chose the perfect seat for the final scene. We stepped into his private boardroom. No windows, no projection screens. Just a 12-seat table, a frosted glass wall with the client's logo etched in gold, and a single monitor at the center, already powered on, waiting. I placed my bag on the table, unzipped it, and pulled out the drive. Brushed aluminum, thumbprint encrypted, tethered to a string of hash-validated logs that could prove minute by minute that every line of code, every commit, every patch had come from me. I slid it into the USB port. The screen blinked. And then it was there. The dashboard. The control center. The very thing I'd been building, refining, hardening, in silence while Chad played PowerPoint tag and restructured the org chart like a toddler with blocks he didn't understand. Real-time telemetry. Load balancer green. Redundancy check confirmed. 4-year roadmap scaffolded in the back end. Version controlled down to the deployment minute. David didn't say anything. He just reviewed the outputs. Clicked a few buttons. Entered a passcode. Then pulled out a sleek black folder. Inside it, 2 documents. The first, standard fare. Client-side deployment acceptance. Signed by him. Signature line for me. I signed it. Simple, clean. The second was heavier. Thicker paper. Legal weight. He slid it across. Post-deployment life cycle, he said. We want you in-house. No middlemen. No Chad. I opened it. Permanent role. Strategic lead. Systems continuity. Triple my salary. Reporting directly to the board. David leaned back. You're not a vendor anymore. You're the architect. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just breathed. For the first time in months, maybe years, the inhale didn't catch in my throat. I closed the folder and nodded. Behind us, the elevator dinged. Footsteps. Fast. Panicked. The glass wall distorted the figure, but I recognized the blur immediately. Chad, red-faced and wild-eyed, slamming a hand against the door like a man who'd just realized the building had no back entrance. "Karen!" he yelled through the glass, muffled by layers of laminate and policy. "This isn't over. You can't just walk away with my client." David stood slowly and pressed a button under the table. The door lock clicked. The boardroom light dimmed. The monitor shut off. Chad kept pounding, shouting something about breach of protocol, about contracts, about betrayal. I picked up the folder, walked to the elevator. David followed me to the threshold, nodded once. "You earned this," he said. "Let the rest rot in their slide decks." The elevator doors opened. As I stepped inside, I glanced back just once. Chad's face was inches from the glass, twisted in rage, screaming something that vanished under the hum of motion. The last thing I saw as the doors slid shut was his palm slapping the glass, helpless and loud, in a room no one had invited him into. Then the doors closed, and I descended. Not just from the floor, from the war, from the noise, from every meeting I was never meant to survive. And as the elevator whispered its way down, I finally smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't ask for applause, doesn't need a witness. The kind that belongs only to the woman who knew, quietly, ruthlessly, that she'd already won.